The hard buzzing of a digital alarm clock slammed through the silent city morning like a hammer through glass. A sharp intake of breath brought the slumbering goblin back to life, her eyes cracking open to the unpleasant glare of the morning soul piercing through the shutters. Through mumbled expletives that cursed her past self, she swung a wild hand off to the side, whacking the snooze button with unwarranted aggression. Letting one more look of disdain linger on the clock that dared perform its intended function, she let her eyes drag close once more. Turning away from the alarm, she nestled back into the covers, and gave them a meek tug to surround herself in a cocoon of fabric. However, no cocoon came to her, in spite of how hard she pulled. With her brows furrowing in annoyance, she cracked an eye open to investigate. Her eye widened in shock, before the other snapped open. She stared at the back of a hulking figure that lay next to her. She sat up quickly, taking in a few panicked breaths as her duvet fell from her lap, and a sudden wave of pain struck her head like an unexpected slap on a bitterly cold day. She brought a hand up to rub the side of her head in the feeble hopes that the throbbing pain would just go away. She winced and muttered another few soft swears. The different waves of emotion hit her like consecutive punches to the mouth, none giving her enough time to even fully process the previous strike, before the next one hit. As the initial greeting of the headache bid its farewell, she let her hand fall down onto the bed. She took in another deep breath to calm herself as she felt the cool air of her central conditioning hit her bare chest. Her eyes snapped open once more and darted downwards as blood rushed to her cheeks. A short, panicked wave of embarrassment forced her to quickly grab the covers from her lap and lift them up to conceal her breasts from the nobody that stood in her apartment to judge her. She inched herself closer to the edge of the bed as the question of the figure that lay beside her returned. She looked back to it, only staring at the back of a head and mostly covered torso to glean some form of identity in spite of her groggy, hungover senses. "What did you get up to last night, girl?" she thought to herself. Long hair. Really long hair. Just extremely hairy in general. Incredibly tall and broad. Probably huge arms. Definitely a forest giant, and a male at that. There was something else, though. A pang of familiarity that brought another wave of disbelief onto her emotionally overloaded mind as she struggled to search her memory for any events of the night before. She knew this man. Or at least she thought she did. And if this situation was how it looked, then she was in for a long conversation with the boss later. Dario was incredibly clear about his thoughts on mixing work and intimacy. While she dreaded that lecture, she wasn't convinced of her own misdeeds. Another wave of embarrassment forced her out of the bed, awkwardly shuffling out of the covers so as not to disturb her slumbering work friend. She edged away from the bed and took another moment to calm down. She looked down at herself again. A familiar pang of dissatisfaction at her poking out stomach pudge took mental priority. The possible partner nearby told her that perhaps others didn't see her in the same light. Coming to a bit of a realization, she took an exaggerated step forwards, her lower half still protected by a pair of her very unflattering boxers. She felt no soreness beyond her head, no pain and no numbness. With a confused expression she looked back at the man that was easily 3 times her size, as assumptions of his endowment and passion made her feel a small amount of pity in the side of her that was still convinced something happened between them. Unable to decide on either possibility, she started to lightly pace back and forth, muttering all manner of rationalizations to herself. Needing more evidence, she started to look around her room. She kept her footfalls as quiet as possible, dreading the awkward conversation that would surely follow his awakening. Her pants and socks lay in a relatively neat pile at the side of her bed. She crouched down to dig through them, finding them all wet and reeking of alcohol. she felt a strange lump in one of her frustratingly tiny pockets. Clawing the object out, she retrieved a violet, translucent gem that was about the size of her palm. It was silent, but the instant it touched her flesh, it began to hum softly in her head. It immediately intruded on her mind with the unwanted presence of magic, and felt icy to the touch, sapping her hand of warmth and heat in a single moment. She dropped it in shock, the precious stone quietly thumping into the pile of clothes as she recoiled. It wasn't anything she owned, that was for sure. It had to be his. Her curiosity continued to demand more answers, her attention turning to his possessions for more information. His clothes were much more spread out, but equally damp. To her incredible relief, she didn't spot his underwear or shirt among the strewn-about outfit, but she did spy a large augmented arm resting against the wall, propped up like a broom. She passed by a closet on her next patrol around the room, stopping to open one of its drawers and grabbing a tacky, oversized t-shirt. She pulled it over her head, struggling to fit her ears through the hole, and once more cursed the human-designed world she lived in. The design of a 7-headed beast surrounded by bottles of water stared up at her, as she took another moment to stare at herself. It hurt her to read the words, "Stay hydrated." But at the same time, it brought her an unexplainable joy. Perhaps it was the memories of her brother's face of utter disgust when she pointed it out to him years ago. Perhaps her sense of humor was just that simple. Returning her attention to the crisis at hand, the clamminess of her palms led her to consider her underarms. Her body still wasn't used to how warm the nights got in Nova. They often led her to waking up sweaty and uncomfortable, just as she was now. Unfortunately, it was impossible for her to discern whether it was the heat of the northern island or the heat of passion that caused her current state. If there was a concrete answer to be found before he woke up, it wasn't in here. She crept to the closed door, her eyes over her shoulder on the sleeping figure for the whole journey. With the finesse of a bumbling ninja, she slipped out of the room to explore the rest of her apartment like it was her first time seeing the place. She cast her gaze around the living room, the shades all closed to hold back the blinding light of the morning soul. Her couch was in more of a state than she remembered, a few of the cushions out of formation, overlapping with some of the others and edging out onto the floor, like someone fell over backwards and tried to take some of the couch with him. If she strained her ears, she could just make out the distant sirens of the NPD out on their morning hunts. A common occurrence ever since they started getting quotas. She paid it little mind as she continued forwards to fix the cushions. Lazily shoving them down and sliding them back into place with her knee, she found her eyes first focused on the scrapes and scuff marks on her kneecap. This attention was short-lived, as her gaze was quickly drawn to an unfamiliar stain on a large part of the upholstery. With the lights off, she couldn't tell what it was. A prodding finger determined it was dry. Something from last night at the earliest. It was dark, like red wine, spreading out like someone had left a leaking bottle on the center of the sofa. Another pang at the back of her head brought a muttered swear to her lips about having another thing to scrub clean once whoever was in her bed was gone. Turning to the coffee table, she felt her heart sink as she spied the crumpled up form of the shirt she remembered putting on the day before, right next to clothes she didn't recognize. Strewn across the glass slab, and tied in a strange ring, the turtleneck was marred with the same stain on the couch, and wet just like the rest of her outfit. As was a black dress shirt, which you could only conclude was the Forest Giant's. Settling her expression into a deep frown, she slapped her hands against the side of her head in frustration. Could she have fallen for that old trick? A conveniently spilled drink to encourage her to change out of her wet clothes? With a silent prayer, she tried in vain to recall anything from the previous day. The last memories she had were that of leaving the apartment, dressed up to go somewhere. Even her destination eluded her, the attempt to recall it bringing another throbbing pain to her head. The young goblin let the attempt die then and there, knowing there must be more clues somewhere. She lumbered on towards the bathroom, sending a glance towards the kitchenette and deciding to check there afterwards. Sucking a breath in to brace herself as she slid the shoji door open. She flicked on the light as she walked past the threshold. The fluorescent bulb erupted into a blinding light that forced the woman to wince, narrowing her eyes to let them adjust to this early morning assault. A light groan of disgust for all things stimulating fought its way out of her throat. When she could finally see, where she had hoped to find clarity only filled her with more confusion. Scanning the room from left to right, her eyes locked onto her missing bra, stained a bespeckled crimson red and sitting on the seat in her shower. The glass doors spotted with the droplets of water from recent use. A number of used tissues surrounded the toilet, as if whoever placed them had little interest in aiming for either the bowl or the nearby trash can. Lastly, she looked at the sink below the mirror. Small flecks of red lingered around the drain, like the beginnings of rain on the city sidewalks, but dragging inwards toward the center, like the porcelain was wet at the time. Taking a few careful steps inside, she let out a soft hiss as the cold tiles greeted her bare feet. She allowed herself a quick glance in the mirror. The brief flash of her thoroughly messy hair hardly surprising her at this point. The signs all pointed to the answer she was hoping wouldn't be true. She turned to face herself, letting out a long, slow breath as she rested her hands on the rim of the sink. Putting her weight under the cold porcelain as she resigned herself to guilt and shame. She needed to bite the bullet and look herself in the eye. To accept this mistake and move on. As she did, something new took her by surprise. In her own reflection, she saw a nasty-looking bruise she didn't recognize. Amidst her disheveled hair and eyeliner that ran down her cheeks, staining them with a fading black. It looked like she attempted to get a very rapid and excruciatingly close look at a streetlight. Her left eye was now sporting a painful-looking black eye that she did not feel until attention was drawn to it. She slowly brought a hand to her face, lightly touching the afflicted eye and wincing as it stung back against her fingertips. A tidal wave of varying emotions crashed over her, each vying for priority in her mind, only muddling her own thoughts. She was paralyzed with uncertainty for a few moments, as each new concern battled it out in her head, the victor being a very deep, very immediate feeling of danger, as the invisible line was drawn between her eye, her scattered clothes, and the man who was currently in her bed. Assumptions and jumping conclusions screamed at her to act, instinct pulling her away from the mirror and back out into the living room. Wrapping her arms around herself as an uncomfortable shudder rocked her entire body. She fought against the thought that had invaded her mind. Unable to dismiss them, she did all in her power to force them to the back of her mind and shove back the sudden overwhelming feeling of vulnerability and weakness that they brought with him. Once steadied that extra bit, she carried on towards the kitchenette, praying to the silent gods that she had done the smart thing and left her phone charging in the answering machine like usual. She had people to call, friends who she could stay with while she figured everything out. She just needed to grab it and go. She could borrow a coat from the caretaker and wait in a coffee shop. There was one nearby that opened unreasonably early. All it hinged on was her phone. Her stomach churned at the idea of having to return to her bedroom with the thought she was burdened with now. Whether they were correct or not. He had seemed so caring when they interacted at work. Could it all have been an act? Nonetheless, she rounded the human-sized counter that blocked her view of the kitchenette, resting a hand against it for support as her feet dragged indecisively forwards. Just ahead of her, waiting right where it always was, sat a foldable plastic step. Though it was only a foot high, it seemed like a mountain to the groggy goblin. She braced her clouded mind for the task ahead, staggering to the base of the stool and straightening up. Taking this journey one step at a time, she held on to the handles of the drawers built into her countertop as she raised her steadiest leg. Placing it firmly on the rough plastic, she winced in anticipation as she pushed down, raising herself up with support from her arms, reaching this painful summit in an instant that took an eternity. With her head finally above the countertops, she spied around for her phone. Still desperate to escape the home she no longer felt safe in, her unfocused eyes shifted around. They passed over an open cabinet, its contents haphazardly strewn across the surface below. Not stopping to examine it further, her gaze came to a stop on a blocky brick of technology that was her phone. It lay, perfectly upright, in its charging port. She let out a relieved sigh, appreciating the one thing about this morning that was simple. However, as she moved a slow hand forwards to collect the device, a light at the base of the answering machine blinked. An unheard message. Curiosity clawed its way back from the hidden corner of her mind that dread had chased it off to, sending a hesitant gaze over her shoulder towards the bedroom. She reached a tentative finger forwards to let it play. The button clicked in compliance as it was pressed down, the machine coming to life with an electronic sizzle. You have 3 new messages. Received yesterday at 9:25 p.m. It whispered, petering out with another sizzle to let the message play. Hey, are you alright? I know you said you'll be fine, but getting dragged into work so late... Look, I'm worried. Just message me in the morning and let me know you got home safe, okay? We'll have our night out eventually. I promise. A familiar voice projected from the answering machine. Rizzy's voice brought the goblin no small amount of comfort. Having something she could recognize with certainty cut through the silent dread that had gripped her body and mind. She attempted to remember last night once again, emboldened by the new information she had. A night out cut short by work. Her mind resisted, just as it had been doing the entire morning. It fought back against her prodding thoughts with worsening throbs of pain that worried her the more she had to struggle with it. Received yesterday at 11:23 p.m. The machine buzzed again, giving her little time to continue sifting through the haze of her clouded mind.
You really picked a bad time to have your phone off, lady. Listen, you better hear this quick. The NPD network is lighting up like sunburst on Dragonflight. Get the fuck out of Aperture. What in the God's non-existent names did you do over there? I heard... It doesn't matter. Just fucking get moving.
The speaker ordered with authority he didn't have. Little Mac's nasally voice brought with it a new level of anxiety. The fellow goblin's usually dismissive tone was replaced with the closest to fearful Mac had ever let it get. In the pause between messages, she considered Mac's words. Whatever she had been called into work to do, clearly it didn't go well. In fact, the NPD having any presence in the Aperture Docklands was incredibly strange. The Steel Purpose were supposed to have that entire district under their robotic thumbs. As she briefly considered the part she could have played in the gang's sudden loss of their cop-free zone, the answering machine buzzed for a third and final time. Received today at 1:03 a.m. It began, the following voice muddled with the background noise of a burning blaze and shouting.
Gaz? Gaz! God damn you, girl, pick up!
Rizzy's voice shouted at her phone, her voice undercut with a few distant gunshots.
I'm coming to find you. The whole fucking district's gone crazy.
Rizzy panted, clearly running as she spoke as the chaos around her bled into the voicemail. Inhuman and unnatural chittering. and screams undercut by the sounds of fighting and the city burning to ash.
If you get this, call me right away.
The kobold was cut off by a nearby screech, the grotesque cry followed by the creak of bending metal, sounding very close to the speaker.
The gold stone! Give us the stone!
An unnatural voice demanded. She edged closer to the phone, resting her hands on the counter as the sounds of Rizzy struggling overtook the riot in the background. Fear gripped at her throat, before a sudden bang caught her off guard. The goblin jolted back as a firearm was discharged right next to the phone. Her eyes widened as fingers gripped on the counter, the following silence lasting for what seemed like hours.
What the fuck? What fucking stone?
Rizzy's haggard voice broke the quiet.
Gaz, where are you?
The voicemail ended abruptly. The goblin left in an uncomfortable silence. She staggered back off the step, almost falling onto the cold tiles below. Still reeling from the messages, she turned aimlessly around and started moving. Her body carried onwards while her mind found itself unable to pick a direction. Before she could even process the repeated cold shock from the kitchen tiles, she found herself back in the living room, grabbing at the cord of her shades. With an aggressive yank, the shades were forced open, the soul light bursting into the room, the building adrenaline allowing the goblin to stand firm against the following headache. As she let her yellowed eyes adjust to the outside light, her fears were confirmed. Through the gaps in between the man-made towers that scraped the sky, she could see numerous thick plumes of coloured arcane smoke rising from what was once the Aperture Docklands. From where she stood, it looked like the entire district was put to the torch. With her mind going a mile a minute, the woman backed away from the windows as NPD cruisers raced up and down every street, sirens still blaring like an alarm clock for the entire city. Her senses came back to her all at once as she felt her back impact the arm of the couch, having staggered back across most of the room without even noticing. Turning to steady herself, her eyes locked once more onto the stains that marred the upholstery. With the new light illuminating the room, she felt her breath catch in her throat as the filth she had so quickly dismissed earlier was viewed in full clarity. Blood. Lots of it. Her gaze snapped to the bedroom door once more, the stillness of her bed partner's form screaming at her as something she should have noticed sooner. Did she hear him breathe? Did she see his chest rise and fall in the darkness? Did he stir at all as she traipsed around the room, digging through their collective belongings? As the questions berated her mind, she edged towards the door, hands wringing with each other as her earlier fears seemed so insignificant. Among the racing thoughts, the voice of the creature over the phone returned as she tried to make sense of it all once more. It demanded the cold stone with such urgency. It couldn't be that little trinket that lay wrapped under her stained clothes. Could it? A heavy fist thudded at the door. She jumped in fright, her hand retracting from the bedroom door handle as her entire form spun to face down the seemingly endless hallway that led to the outside. She held still for a few seconds, unsure if she could even trust her ears at this point. 3 more thuds followed, confirming for her that this, at least, was real. She darted her eyes between the door beside her and the hallway, really wishing she had taken up Dario's offer of a gun when she had started working for him. Hesitation held her trapped in its unforgiving grip as she prayed to the gods for the knocker to assume no one was home.
Nova Police Department. I'd just like to ask you a few questions.
A reptilian voice broke its way through the door. What the fuck did we get up to last night, Gas?